Yep.
Right, so thanks now. I'll try. I can give you something very good. So I will try to keep this briefer because it's a long morning and everybody is probably tired, not to mention hungry. But so I'll focus like on the more important things and skip a little bit of technical content. But it kind of goes back to all these questions, now and Peter and the others were asking about, potential, I suppose, directions. And like big questions we could be answering with the help of quantum. And I suppose one key question that psychologists keep asking ourselves, is why is human thought the way it is? And some super influential individuals, psychologists such as Roger Shepard had this idea of universal laws of thought. In fact, he gave a very memorable Ramchal Prize lecture, whereby he essentially spent 1 hour talking about physics. He didn't mention one thing about psychology, right? And what he was implying is that if psychology is going to be like a proper science, it needs to mimic physics, or just try to find universal laws. Of course, you have like John Anderson, another very influential psychologist, with his idea of that we can understand cognition and thought to the extent that we view it as an adaptive process. And questions that seem very current are ones like, can we build an artificial intelligence which mimics or exceeds human capacity? We know the answer to that, it's already been done. What is the functional purpose of consciousness? So of course, now is a foremost expert on consciousness, but in this discussion sometimes a story seems to be lacking as to why we have this why we have the sense that we are conscious or about certain aspects of our cognition, and how can we model our sense of identity and purpose? Again, these are fundamental questions, but actually surprisingly absent in the law of cognitive modeling. So interestingly, in what's considered the inaugural foundational meeting for artificial intelligence, you have good representation of psychologists such as Marvin Minsky and Herbert Simon. So, all right. I'm not going to talk about these. These are, some of the kind of like amusing results that have motivated the introduction of quantum methods in psychology, such as order effects and Galois balls. That's one of my favorite ones, and you may not be quite as familiar with it. It's the categorization decision paradigm by Jim Townsend, who's a good friend of Jerom's. And basically the idea was he showed like faces, and he asked participants to either make a categorization, is the face good or bad, and then always make a decision, attack versus withdraw. And what he found was that the probability to attack when the face was good was about 7%. It's kind of weird by itself, right? So you're seeing somebody, you think it's a good blow, but you still decide to attack. The probability to attack when the person is bad, it's about 50%. It's kind of more reasonable. But like, if you don't make the categorization, just go for it. So I call this shoot first, ask questions later effect. And actually, again, in terms of order effects, and there are many other examples that outside psychology you may be slightly less familiar with. So there's a really topical order effect in relation to medical trainees being presented with information about the lab test and physical exam versus the other way around, and actually the probabilities for exactly the same infection based on exactly the same data vary. And of course, that's kind of like shocking to a lot of people, because if there is one area where we expect a decision making to be as normative as possible, it is medical decision making. And similar results exist in relation to legal decision making. So anyway, a lot of people often think that contextuality is only some sort of like approximation or fantasy in the mind? Well, I mean, there are kind of like real world examples which might be a bit contrived, but nonetheless, there are real world examples which, which are contextual. So that's James Yeasley's example. Baby Eve loves sleeping on her front. Is eating sleeping on her back at 10 a.m. or 11 p.m. Her parents can check, but this disturbs her and she rolls over. So if you look at probability that she is on her back at 10 o'clock, that's low by assumption because she likes sleeping on her front. If you look without any prior measurements at probability that she's sleeping on her back at 11 o'clock, it's also low. But if you actually measure both, then that becomes a lot higher. Because when you measure at 10, you disturb her. So she changes position, and then you're more likely to find her sleeping on her back. So that's kind of like, so I mean, there are situations where our question will disturb the system in the external world, and that will kind of generate a type of contextuality that is characteristic of like quantum theory. And of course, we have Peter's very recent important results as well. So the thing I kind of want to focus on, which might again become a little more novel, is that there are like three distinctions in cognition, which are quite important. There's the rational versus heuristic decision making, and rational is typically associated with Bayesian reasoning. System one versus system two, and familiar versus unfamiliar. And as well as there's been quite a discussion about where quantum fits here by itself or here by itself, but never really consideration of how it fits across all three distinctions. And that's as well as the thing that is what I wanted to briefly talk to you about. Okay, so distinction one. So again, I'm kind of like not belaboring these points in the interest of time and lunch. Now, when being asked about how people should reason, then I think most cognitive psychologists assume that the normative mode of reasoning is just Bayesian probability theory. And they're all very influential people who've been advocating this view. I think it's without convention, basically. Now, it's kind of worth pointing out that the normative status of Bayesian theory in cognition is not without good motivation. So if you consider our kind of just mammalian cousins, a Bayesian animal will have a survival advantage versus a non-Bayesian one in terms of predation risks, maybe foraging or whatever. In fact, there are animal cognition researchers who make these arguments. They say, well, let's take a squirrel or whatever, whose estimation of predation risks is not Bayesian. Well, they've got an evolutionary disadvantage. As far as we know, there is evolutionary pressure that, when we consider like survival relevant behaviors, we got to be as Bayesian as possible. I mean, it's almost obvious, right? And there are animals, like I said, there are animal researchers who are making this argument. Now, of course, the difference between animals and humans is that animals have a limited range of questions that they're preoccupied with or that exist in their minds, whereas in the case of our humble selves, we've got an infinite number of questions in our minds. And again, I mean, this is not this is certainly not a novel insight in psychology, right? It's the problem is that if you're trying to be fully Bayesian, then you need a joint probability distribution, and of course, as your number of questions increases, that becomes completely intractable. So, I mean, just going very quickly through that. So, even like for say 10 questions, 10 binary questions, you've got your joint probability distribution of about 1,000 terms. Just increase the complexity by a little bit, you get to 130,000 terms. I mean, again, I'm talking to algorithms of computer scientists, right? So it's probably a super straightforward insight. Psychologists, took a little bit longer to realize it, and essentially how to go from the intractability of baseline Bayesian theory to whatever the mind is is arguably the most important issue in cognitive science. And I'm not just saying that. Herbert Simon, who invented the notion of bounded rationality, got a Nobel Prize. Daniel Kahneman, who got the Nobel Prize with for prospect theory in his other work. Again, he's like the pioneer, as was arguably, of the heuristics movement in psychology. Richard Thaler, again Nobel Prize, in relation to his work on nudges. In fact, I think these are the only Nobel Prize in psychology, right? And they all relate to the same issue. And actually, Nick Chater is getting the Ramaphal Prize this year. Again, kind of like pioneered a lot of sort of information correct approaches to cognition. So yeah, a lot rides on how to resolve this question. So right, so one kind of Bayesian baseline Bayesian theory. What does it do instead? Herbert Simon's idea is we have bounded rationality. Huge influential idea. Tversky, Kahneman, Thaler, lots of others, well, heuristics and biases. Nick Chater, Mike Oxford, and others have been adopting Bayesian variants whereby you can quote-unquote simplify Bayesian calculation through sampling simplifications to your computational probabilities. All right, so let's look at these distinctions. So distinction one, rational versus heuristic. There is evidence that, so the summary in relation to that distinction is that there is evidence that sometimes cognition is Bayesian. There's plenty of evidence that cognition can be inconsistent with baseline Bayesian inference. So when it's inconsistent, we could, such behavior could be characterized as heuristic principles or Bayesian principles augmented with heuristic principles or something else. And of course, that's where we come. We think that another way in which baseline Bayesian inference could be simplified is by using quantum-like representations. All right, let's talk a little bit about system one versus system two. So system one is meant to be rushed, reflective, intuitive, automatic, fast. System two, thoughtful, analytic, considered, reflective. Now, Daniel Kahneman's book is hugely successful. If you ever find yourself teaching master's students to behave economics, system one, system two is pretty much all they know about, right? I mean, so like a lot of the applied value of cognitive psychology in finance, marketing, whatever, is realized through that insight. Okay, so one tempting inference, which I think is wrong, is that system one is heuristic. Remember, that's a fast one. System two is rational, right? And that's meant to be the analytic one. But I think that's wrong because Bayesian probabilistic reasoning is meant to be about intuition being consistent with Bayesian theory, not analytic calculation. I mean, when people say we're Bayesian, nobody means that we're computing probabilities. I don't know how to compute probabilities, but rather that when we actually estimate probabilities, we do so in a way consistent with Bayesian principles. So I don't think that works. Let's have a look at familiar versus unfamiliar quickly. So we know practice and familiarity makes cognition faster and more automatic. Maybe practice means behavior is based more on instances rather than working through problems. So that's Gordon Logan's idea. And let's Bayesian approaches to the debate between I mean, like I said, one idea is that the demand approximates Bayesian probabilities through sampling, and essentially what a lot of people have said recently and very influentially is that as we sample information from the environment to compute probabilities, and that can be either error-prone or more or less extensive, and that's how fallacies arise. Okay, so another aspect to this debate from the Bayesian perspective, that is the problem of how to go from baseline Bayesian theory to something more tractable, is Bayesian networks. And Judea Pearl is what he sort of popularized the idea of causal networks. Again, very, very important. The recent Nobel Prize related. And they simplify the joint probability solution needed for certain questions by assuming certain questions to be independent. And instead of having like all these bajillion terms of a standard joint problem distribution, you have fewer terms. You also have the idea of local Bayesian inference. So Stephen Solomon, who's a very, very influential cognitive psychologist, and one of his students proposed the idea of local computations, which is in causal inference. It basically means you just ignore the full space of dependencies. You just only look at a particular subset. And Lewandowski et al. Still Lewandowski is again a very influential cognitive psychologist, and a similar idea of knowledge partition. So essentially, we are rational in only particular subsets of our overall space. We're not rational in an overall completely consistent way, but rather in particular subsets. And of course, knowledge partition sounds very like partial Boolean algebra, right? Like I mean, all this stuff is meant to motivate quantum-like cognition, but the idea of local computation, the idea of knowledge partitions, all these kind of very much resonate with how we understand quantum theory. Okay, so what can we do with quantum theory? So the idea we've been trying to use to motivate the adoption of quantum methods in psychology is quantum theory can be seen as a local version of Bayesian theory, getting around some complexity limitations. And the price you pay for that is contextuality that may not exist. So that's, I suppose, I'll show you later what we've done in relation to this, but obviously what we've done is more for mathematician or computer science to do. So, that's certainly an area where we need more help. So the idea, so obviously that's obvious to at least half the room.
Wait. So is your idea kind of closer to what Steve was talking about? Like locally classical, but globally.
Yes. Well, you're locally classical, but globally you're not. Yes, it's like having these presheets, I suppose. Yeah, but I mean, it is about having. Look, it's like having a partial. I mean, that's how I understand it. It's like having a partial. If you have a Boolean algebra, then all your questions, Bayesian inference for all combinations of questions. If you have a partial Boolean algebra, you have Bayesian inference for subset of questions. But when you try to combine something from here to there, then you get interference effects and non-Bayesian effects. But it's like here everything is compatible. Here these sets are compatible, but questions between sets are incompatible. So all these ideas relate. They're just different ways to express this insight in quantum computation. Okay, so all right, so I'm going to skip all that because it's a little more technical and it's not really that important. But essentially, I suppose that does relate to Stephen's talk from the morning a little bit. We try to quantify the information theoretic saving one would get if one were to adopt either baseline Bayesian methods or Bayesian networks or quantum theory. Now, we used a sort of combinatorics approach. Again, we can talk about this like informally later. We tried to come up with an expression for. I'm just going to skip all that. We came up with an expression which is essentially the complexity of encoding the probability information for n questions with k outcomes across different schemes. And of course, it's not going to surprise anybody that either quantum theory or Bayesian networks has hugely lower cost compared to baseline Bayesian theory, right? And that's kind of beyond obvious. What is a little bit more subtle is that we think quantum theory is a little bit cheaper than Bayesian methods as well, under some conditions of making them equivalent. However, that's definitely an issue where more input from mathematicians or engineers or computer scientists would be very valuable. So, of course, the thing to remember here is that if your world is all Bayesian and you end up representing some questions as incompatible, you make an approximation. Say, Linda is feminist and Bucknell or not. There's no real incompatibility between questions like this. And the way we think about it is that, you know, you make this approximation, introduce this curious contextuality, because that enables you to simplify your probability information a little bit. And then as you gain more familiarity with particular question combinations, you go from something that's incompatible, spuriously incompatible, to something that's compatible. So just come to that shortly. All right, so let's skip some of that stuff. So that's kind of really the most important slide. That's kind of really the slide I want to present. So the rest, you know, is less important. So, right, so distinction one, visual histories. So maybe this about some questions being compatible versus compatible. I mean, that's kind of like a little bit given from a lot of the work we've been doing. Distinction two, this is system one versus system two. Well, right, so our preliminary thought is that compatible representations require more effort to build, because compatible representations, you know, they're basically tensors of individual questions, so they need the largest space, right? So that kind of feels like it's more effortful. So maybe being more careless or rushed means that insufficient effort to build compatible representations is in place. So that, you know, if you're rushing or if you don't care about the task, you're more likely to be quantum-like. But, you know, if you put a lot of effort, a lot of time into a task, you're more likely to be more Bayesian. But of course, it's the problem of Stephen Hayato and others is, you know, how can we sort of like go from one to the other? Is it not got like a presentation for Linda being Bankteller and feminist, the two questions as compatible? How, and you know, I've got the presentation of space, you know, I've got like a particular space, particular angles for the arrays, etc. How do I go from that representation to an equivalent representation where the questions that Linda is for Linda being a banker or a feminist are compatible? So I mean, we just lack this step, and that's like for me the biggest technical challenge currently. And finally, distinction three, familiarity versus unfamiliarity. Well, compatible representation questions require more complex representations. We think that's reasonable. Maybe this takes time. So initially compatible questions, you know, which would be associated with more fallacies, gradually become compatible, which would be more Bayesian. But once you have compatible reps, maybe judgments can become more automatic, because then, you know, you're in a tensor product space, you just project into feminist and Bankteller or feminist and non-Bankteller. It's not a sequential judgment anymore, it's a one-shot judgment. So diagrammatically, and I hope you like this diagram because it took me absolute ages to make. Let's say you're interested in whether a person is happy, healthy, and fit, and you know it's the first time you consider this question. So you have an incompatible basis sets for each question. I mean, this representation makes sense, right? You know, if you're healthy, you're likely to be happy, right? You project close, and if you're fit, you're likely to be healthy, right? But you know, if you're fit, you know, it doesn't tell you as much about being happy. And then, as you consider these questions together, eventually you build, well, if there are binary questions, you get an n-dimensional space. So if there are only 3 dimensions, you have like one eigenstate for whether the person is happy, healthy, and fit, or one eigenstate for the person is clearly quite happy. It's not quite unhealthy, right? Healthy smoking, and doesn't look very fit as well, and you know, and so on. So I think that's kind of more or less what I wanted to say. Let me just quickly check. So yes, I mean I can stop here because that's basically what I wanted to tell you. And that's where I think you know, I think that's one way in which to develop, I suppose, a technical aspect of the quantum-like cognition research program is how to understand better the transition from here to there, and I suppose validate some of these assumptions, because currently, of course, there are assumptions. So I'll also clear. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Any comments? Questions? Thanks, Emmanuel. Yeah, but I think I have a clear
understanding of the original question about linen. So from a sheet theory perspective, it would be, my guess is, it would be the change of base that you get from the continuous function okay, conceptually, I could see it as changing the base. So going from incompatible to compatible is changing the underlying space from, say, non-orthogonal. Now, in sheet theory perspective, every continuous function induces both the inverse image functor and the direct image functor. And so you can think, well, the way I see the inverse image functor is a kind of splitting of a dimension into a pair of dimensions, which would give you your orthogonality and your compatibility. So I think the sheet theory perspective give you the framework, and the question is how to model that.
Yeah, so I mean, here you have like certain angles, right?
Mm.
Here, of course, you have a normal basis.
Mm.
I mean, I get the point that for good solution here, it could be modeled as amplitudes on your state. But just, I don't know, that doesn't quite seem enough, right? I mean, I suppose, yeah, I suppose that's the kind of like, and also, I mean, I'm slightly less clear how it works if you have like a mixed representation or something like what we're talking about yesterday, but it's they, I mean, are similarity measure as far as I can tell. Here is sequential projection. So once you go sequential projection here, well, what do you have here exactly? So I mean, there are some questions that just kind of like really vague about.
This really corresponds to pre-sheet and the sheet, right?
Yeah, so
the top right is pre-sheet,
yeah,
and the bottom right is the sheet.
yeah. So the inverse image functor includes the sheetification step. But basically, in my case, it's very, very simple. You can have a more complex arrangement of space, of dimensions, and so forth. But just put very, very simply, and analogous to your diagram there, as you pull back across the continuous function. For example, a continuous function send a topological space of 2 points into the trivial topological space, and so when the process of going back, pulling back the pre-sheet or the sheet that's sitting on the trivial topological space back across to the other is analogous to splitting the dimensions or widening the dimensions or orthogonalizing the dimensions. And that step itself, in fact, there are two. You can do the pullback for just pre-sheets, or you can do the pullback for the sheet. And the pullback for the sheet cases is to do the sheetification step after you've already pulled. But basically, what pullback is doing is taking the data attached to the original space and pulling it back to the and reattaching it to the new space. And that reattachment process can involve the sheetification, the kind of completion step in itself, which would correspond to the move from incompatibility to compatibility in the pre-sheet sheets. So I think in principle, the sheet theory does that. But what you really want to ask is how to at the modeling level. So
What we're going to do,
yeah, exactly.
If we say something like this, psychologists without any background, it's just going to run away.
Yeah, so yeah, right.
I'm very interested in the sociality and the quantumness. That's you mentioned about animals and humans distinction. I think that social animals, including humankind, tends to have some countable degrees of freedom. My idea is that the violation of the so-called sure thing principle is for example, the information that's now is very bad guy or good guy, then I choose attack or not or something, is if I informed about the deterministic property of the null, the sum of these attacking is higher than the indeterminate case. So I read something papers about that. So the indeterminacy of the good or bad decreases my attacking attitude. So it can be interpreted that in social reaction, to choose attack or something really affects his attitude. So the choosing principle depends on some very big idealization that my choice of attitude does not affect his attitude, good or bad. So it is actually superposed. And why this is not just a mixture of the probabilities. The classical idea of the classical probability is the independence of our choice and the probability distribution of something. So for the social kind of items, it is quite natural to think about the violation of sure thing principle. So I think the social kind of birds, some kind of birds, and monkeys, humankind, can have the quantum kind of violation. This is my hypothesis.
So for interacting agents like this, it becomes a little more complicated because then obviously it's a game theoretic situation, right? And I mean, at least humans seem to be influenced by cognitive dissonance, which basically is that if there's a mismatch between beliefs and actions, you try to align them. And in fact, the original presence dilemma model that Jeremy and I worked on had a mechanism whereby if I was intending to cooperate, I would be guessing the opponent cooperates as well. And if I was intending to defect, I'd be guessing the opponent would defect as well, right? So it was like it's a sort of degree of entanglement. But I mean, so I agree with you. I suppose for just leaving aside the interaction between agents, I mean, there is a vague prediction here that, and I mean, I know that sounds a bit strange, but I'll just say it because I think that's what the implication is. The less sophisticated from a cognitive perspective the agent, the more Bayesian it should be. So simpler animals, you'd expect them to be more Bayesian. Younger children, you'd expect them to be more Bayesian. I mean, we think that fallacies is a result of your probability distribution becoming just way too complex. And from a baseline Bayesian point of view, so that you start needing to just approximate things to simpler spaces.
Yeah, that actually gives a very simple and nice prediction that within animal, the sociality and the quantumness kind of correlate.
Sure, of course, yeah, yes.
This is my hypothesis. And actually, historically, physicists were surprised because electron seems to be very human. So the physicist, classical physics idea is when it goes to micro and reduced to the atom or something, then it will become objective. Objective means some kind of classical kind of thing. Everything will be deterministic or something, but so it seems like the electron has some kind of free will or something. So you cannot force him hard. So kind of this interaction, is inevitability of the interaction that our choice and their outcome is very complicated to interact. Seems means the need from the classical probability escape from the classical probability, because classical probability depends on the idea that some choice is independent for something. So if you want to do something in classical probability, then almost all candidates is sampling or the condition. But yeah, there is more and more complicated reaction between that kind of thing. So I think that this quantum nature is quite have a merit for the especially the social count in interactive.
Yeah.
So I'll take the conversation in a different direction, because if I ask myself, you know, why quantum? And then the first thing, for me, this is an ontological question. So if you're trying to address some phenomena, whether quantum phenomena or a cognitive phenomena, then we want to understand the underlying nature of that phenomena. And so, of course, we make some assumptions, and then the first, I think, is that we assume some indeterminacy, so that not every point in time is a definite cognitive state, for example. The second is if we have indeterminacy, then this is a sufficient condition for incompatibility. So we're willing to assume, or we think the underlying nature of the phenomena has sometimes incompatibility, sometimes compatibility, but the possibility of incompatibility is there. And when you have incompatibility, then we have reason to believe that there is some contextuality. So for me, and then for Miato's discussion, I think the next thing is that I think really following from that, we need some new notion of causality within this reality, not the classical, normal, uncommon sense. So this, I think, is really, so if we assume such things, right, then this is why we say why quantum. But the counter arguments are strong. So, for example, I think it's well known, right, with the Bayesian models, we can actually build successful models by assuming that everything's determined, right? Like a cognitive state is always in a determinate state. We have success doing that. When we're using such models, everything's compatible. So then people say, well, why do we need to believe in incompatibility? And then contextuality, well, we have some sort of context sensitivities of that contextuality. So then the counter arguments to why, from my point of view, these ontological questions, they're very, very powerful counter arguments, both theoretically and empirically. But so that's why I think that really, in order to be strong about why quantum, we really need to be convincing about why, for example, why would we believe that the underlying phenomenon is indeterminate? And I think we have some, you know, arguments like that. By assuming that, we can come up with more parsimonious decision models, for example. So we are already starting that. But we really need to be very, very clear and argue clear. Why do we believe this phenomenon is indeterminate? Why do we believe that incompatibility can be present? Why do we believe the contextuality might be there? Because these for me are the three, and also a new form of causality. These are the four very, very ontologically related questions that I think are important to invest in, based on my talk yesterday. But this, for me, is really where it all comes from.
Absolutely, I completely agree. So first of all, let me say, I think that I take it for granted that complete pure cognition will include a Bayesian and a non-Bayesian component. I think you know, sometimes we get criticized for thinking, you know, everything's quantum. I think that's a kind of strong position. So then the challenge becomes to just identify the boundary conditions between Bayesian and non-Bayesian. And in that non-Bayesian set, we assume some of it is quantum, some of it maybe not. The point about being not terminate, I gotta say, I'm not sure that would be convincing, because for most psychologists, they take for granted there is uncertainty, right? I said it can be classical. It could be just linear mixtures where, you can just extract information from the linear mixture without altering the state.
Can I interrupt? This is a very, very important point, but when we're talking about indeterminacy, it's not an epistemic. So the indeterminacy, so we need to argue that the actual phenomena, there is no underlying fact of the matter.
That's fine.
This is hard to argue, I agree.
I get what you meant. You're talking about ontic, not epistemic uncertainty. I'm just saying that for all psychologists, if the fundamental motivating assumption for the cognition in such program is indeterminacy at the ontic level, it may not be convincing because they'll counter argue that, well, you know what, you've got uncertainty of an epistemic nature, we're quite happy with it. So that's why, I suppose, from my point of view, I want to take a step back and ask, well, all right, so let's adopt like Roger Shepard's or John Anderson's perspective and ask, all right, so is there an adaptive justification for the use of such methods in cognition? And then the adaptive argument gets us to everything else. So I mean, I agree with a lot of it. I mean, but I suppose I'd be a little bit suspicious. I think, just trying to think of how our colleagues think. I'd be a little bit suspicious of an argument that just puts indeterminate, not indeterminate, as fundamental as motivating assumptions. I think that kind of ideally should follow from a more basic argument as to why these type of representations are relevant. So that's information theoretical argument you try to build, and I mean I know it's not even half, like a tenth developed, but I suppose that's an attempt to say, well, actually, it gives you, if you're rushing and if you want to save resources and everything, it may make sense to just start with incompatible representations and just build them up as you need to.
It might be different enough. Just prove up. Yeah, I understand the difficulty to persuade the conventional people. It is a very important question. But first, we must understand that our question is not why quantum, but why classical. Yeah, because there is no evidence which whole the nature can be put onto the classical probability, which seems, as a mathematician, quite special kind of theory for the probabilistic nature. Actually, von Neumann's book is precedes the Kolmogorov books, historical also. So if you want to model the stochastic phenomena, the Kolmogorovian classical probability is only one candidate. So, and it is strongly related as an assumption that there is events which is independent ultimately, and sampling something is the conditioning or something. So the bunch of the axioms is not so much universal in our experience. So from the phenomenological way of thinking, the appearance, the phenomena is a very evident thing, and the relationship between the phenomena is also evident, but it is not evident for classical representation of such kind of thing. So if you admit this, then the real question is why classical, when classical or something. But I understand. To persuade something is very, very difficult question. So, but why my answer for the why classical means some kind of, if you determine some aspects, only one aspect of the world, something fixed the aspect you want to talk. For example, you may want to understand only position or only momentum, only X spin or something, then you get the classical representation. So that kind of, if you fix some aspects, then the classical appears. So yeah,
So, all right, so this is obviously very interesting comments. But I mean, cognitive scientists and psychologists will answer that why classical, because of the Dutch book theory, for example, right? So again, I mean, Dutch book theory is really quite well used in psychology, and it's about the fact that if your probabilities are Bayesian, you're protected from natural laws. But also the point about Bayesian theory is that the macroscopic world is essentially mostly Bayesian, right? I mean, I showed the baby example earlier, and I think there are some cases where questions may disturb the system, but psychologists look at the world, they say, well, it's all Bayesian, right? It's all classical logic, so that's the probability that we think.
but it depends on the sure thing principle.
Yeah, right, of course, but again, just leaving aside interacting agents, that's what they probably say. And like I said earlier, also with any minimal behavior, I mean, there are adaptive arguments. Unless you're Bayesian, you're gonna have like a disadvantage in evolution. So I mean, I think the Bayesian position in psychology is extremely well established as a default position. So the owner seems to just convince them something else is needed.
But I think that's gonna change, actually. I'm very, optimistic about that, really, because the data sharing nature has changed dramatically across all the science. And I think, the classical psychology has been dominating, I think primarily because data availability. And also the way experiment was constructed and things like that. And previously, if you look at the very old literature, only 1 point as a mean across all the trials is only reported. But now we don't need to report like that. We can upload all the raw data, from which we can reconstruct all this, all the effects and things like that can be recovered. And once all this raw data becomes available, then some of our speculation that we talked about today, like a training effect, like initial couple of 10 trials will have a very strong quantum effect, can be actually analyzed really quickly if 10,000 of behavior data is already available, and without collapsing it into like a simplest situation, like only mean reaction time accuracy. We can look at the interaction of all these things. And then once we deal with the reality, I think it's, I agree with like the quantum, the classical description is too simple to address reality, I think, and then this will be coming as the data will be reported as raw and so will be shared freely. I never noticed actually about this asymmetry in our, similarity matrix unless, my student actually collected data and they showed it to me. Because, all the literature doesn't show it. Right? It's unavailable to the, analysis.
So I think in the end, I'm kind of building on this discussion, and I would like to get your perspective, Emmanuel, because you were asking about, you were, like bringing out the idea that we kind of need to, like communicate with practitioners, say, like, psychologists, cognitive scientists, like, how to think, say, outside the box, ever so slightly. So I think there are a few points, I guess, like to bring out. So one is, the use of classical versus quantum probability. So that's one choice. If you choose classical probability, there's plenty of, say, non-Bayesian methods, all of the frequencies stuff that goes in there. So
like the sampling methods I mentioned.
Exactly. Yeah, but not exactly like, it's an approximation to Bayesian. Like, most people will see those as like two different schools of thought in a sense, right? So the Bayesian being, okay, we have parameters that are also random variables and we are trying to, so we have a prior on them, and the frequencies, they are fixed variables, and all we need is just do estimation of, say, deterministic quantities. And this is like a small change, but for people it's like, somehow, like, there's battles, there's wars, say, between these communities. So one way is to take the ontological approach and to say, no, okay, there is a strong reason to choose quantum probabilities first. So forget about the other stuff and we'll think about that for, something. The other one is more epistemological, like, practical thing. So I bet that I could take a lot of, say, unexplained data, build like a stupidly complex Bayesian hierarchical something model, 700 parameters that I will never be able to estimate, but, it should work. So maybe there is something that can just be told about simplicity, parsimony. So what is your stance on that?
Well, I mean, Peter made the point earlier as well, right? So, fit those models and, they do a good job. So hence we justify the use of quantum. But I think psychologists, I think as a science, right? In any science, people expect a more foundational argument. So in physics, there is like Lucien-Hardy's Lucien-Hardy style attempts whereby you have like these basic intuitions about nature, and from these you try to derive quantum. So I suppose for a long time, we've been looking for something analogous in psychology. I think at the end of the day, well, maybe that's my personal bias, but I just find it slightly unsatisfying just to have a whole bunch of models and say, well, actually, these work really well, right? So, here we are. And indeed, by analogy, I mean, the Bayesians have done that. The Bayesians never kind of started from a purely operational, if you want, approach. They say, well, our models work. They had like all these arguments that, Dutch book theorem being one of them, that's saying, well, there are good reasons why we ought to be Bayesian. And then they proceed to actually develop all these specific models. So, I mean, I don't know, I suppose the proof of the pudding will be data, but I mean, currently, like the quantum cognition researchers, I mean, we represent a fair percentage, right? I mean, we're a tiny community. It's like probably what, 0.001%, whereas the Bayesians are probably double digits. And, that's what the state of the field is. You try to offer them something that goes against the status quo. I think you need to work extra hard to convince them that there's something to it.
Right, you also need to provide a tools as well.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I guess.
And that also changes the Bayesian versus frequent this kind of view, right? Completely over the last 20 years or so, When I was a student, Bayesian was completely ignored because nobody could do it. But all my students are using Bayesian right now. Because it's so easy right now.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I guess, my question probably could be rephrased that, how do you fight your battle?
Yeah. That's a good question for tomorrow, actually.
That's a good question for tomorrow. I can't feel it's quite a long question as well. But I mean, it's, now it's absolutely right. I mean, like the Bayesians have essentially regularized a lot of these tools, whereas, in quantum theory, for the first, Peter well knows, for the first 10 years or so, we essentially just, start all our papers by saying we don't assume a quantum brain. I mean, and very basic things, right? Just show like a simple two-dimensional diagram, which I think is actually a lot simpler than working with probability distribution. And they say, oh, no, that's too complicated, right? But I mean, that we just, I mean, in order, just very, very briefly, I suppose the strategy has been, first of all, take some really established findings that have presented conceptual paradoxes like the conjunction fallacy and try to provide sort of more elegant quantum models. Then secondly, the second step is trying to create new predictions like, what all of us have been talking about over the last few days, indeed what Jura was talking about just earlier, right? Just some surprising prediction, like the, polarizer effect, that, just make people take a step back and think, like Jerome's QQ code, for example, or the quantum Zinn effect, things like this. And I think that, so we are in this second stage, right? We just try to surprise them and excite them, saying, well, it's not just about modeling results that are like 40 years old. And I think the third step is the foundational argument, whether one takes Peter's approach or an adaptive argument or something else. I think that's the third step, to just kind of like try to basically, offer a justification as to why this kind of like principles make sense in cognition. So that, I mean, you know, we've done our best. I mean, you know, I suppose the mark of how well we're succeeding is how many people are interested in our work, right? I mean, there are some really, you know, like now, for example, got interested recently, and you know, that feels like a big victory, but still, you know, it does feel like very much a sort of fringe area still.
Why classical? But I think this distinction, I think there are two senses of classical here. I think Bayesian as a classical, I would regard Bayesian as classical. When I say classical, I'm more like symbol systems, the idea of mapping to a structure. And so the point about the task I was talking about is it's optimal, but at a different level. But in fact, there are two levels of optimal within the individual task instance and optimal over the series of tasks. So the reason, I didn't explain this very well because it wasn't a simple learning task, but it was a series of, it was like a learning to learn style task where you had to induce the structure of a series. So there's optimality at two levels. And so to my mind, the Bayesian approach is really just optimal at the first level. And indeed the second level, the what's called the relational scheme reduction or induction task or learning transfer style task. So the point about being classical is, in that sense, is that you can't get predictions on novel task stimuli in the same sort of sense. That, and the point about that is that there is no similarity of the individual task stimuli that affords any kind of generalization. You have to have the structure in the first place. That's why. So I suspect the reason is because in psychology, there's really just one level. But in category theory, when we talk about universality, it's always with respect to a particular kind of category. And so I can talk about the universal construction within a category, but I can also talk about it within a category of categories. And so you have these two different levels. And to my mind, that's the crucial difference, is how you transcend and transcend this level of being able to see. The reason why some people never induce a structure is because they just think that all I have to do is this individual task and move on to the next individual task and keep going until I get I've done the experiment and I move on. Where other people think, well, there's a two level, there's a task itself, but there's a task over task, the structure, the common structure of the task. And so your point about the local, and one that you mentioned, the local is classical, is quite interesting. So the reason why I like the sheet theory approach is because it's very natural to talk about, we have a local understanding of this particular thing, and have a local understanding of this thing, and they may not originally, they could be originally thought as independent, and then eventually as your knowledge expands, but then you realize, mismatch.
I think we need to spend some time considering how we could use shift theory. That's one next, yeah.
But yeah, okay. Well, very interesting.
Well, Susan's comment. I was at a Bayesian cognition tutorial at CogSci 2019, and I already putting that other layer on top of the underlying Bayesian layer. They recognised exactly the point, so that they were building this other layer on top. So I can't remember how they were doing, but it was consistent with that particular mindset and how they do things. So I'm guessing that there are already alternatives for that.
Yeah, maybe let's wrap up. Hayato is coming. So see you again. And I'm very happy to discuss very heavy and fruitful discussion. Thank you. And keep in touch. Yeah, I put the working section on. Yeah, that is what you said. All right. So
Thanks, Hayato.
see you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So those lines. I